Steven, on the most recent episode of Into the Aether, we talked a little bit about Another Crab's Treasure, which is a new indie game that is blending the early 2000s platformer, like mascot platformer, like a Glover or a Mario or a Banjo-Kazooie or something, with Soulslikes in terms of its combat. And we talked a lot about, you know, the different ways in which that game, I think, sets itself apart from the crowd in terms of like adding to the lineage of Souls-likes as a genre, which, you know, has become a genre over the years. You look at really formative games in terms of the ways in which they have kind of bubbled up and become their own thing. Metroid and Castlevania becoming Metroidvanias, and all of the various games that have taken those kinds of inspirations from there. But what FromSoft has done with Demon's Souls onwards has definitely inspired so many game developers to pick and choose little pieces of those games that really work for them here and there. And I think Another Crab's Treasure is a great example of a developer with like a really keen eye for the pieces of that genre that are additive to that experience, instead of feeling like you are overwhelming the player with just like, why don't I just go play Dark Souls then? You know, if you want to be Dark Souls so badly. And right. I think there are a couple angles to this conversation, but I think one of them right at the top is like, what do you think is the thing that has made the Souls-like genre kind of bubble up outside of just what FromSoft is doing and has become a thing that so many developers are trying to emulate or expand upon?
That's a great question. And it's one that I'm kind of continuously searching for the answer for. Like you said, it is like firmly a genre at this point. I think there was a while where people kind of made fun of the term, and it like became exhausting to see how many games were including, you know, it's like Dark Souls in their pitch.
Right.
But I think it's worth taking a step back and be like, well, why is that the case? You know, of course there are a lot of games that are like trying to capitalize on the hype and popularity, but there are also a lot of games that are just genuinely trying to take that design and move it forward or put their own spin on it. And I think what's interesting about games is that, unlike other media, iteration is much more heavily encouraged, to the point where like it's not frowned upon to maybe just take a mechanic one-to-one and be like, okay, we're gonna mash this game up with this one and just see what happens.
I forget what game design engine it is. It might be Game Maker Studio comes with the jump physics from Mario like built into it.
Yeah.
Just to like show you exactly how that works.
And I bring that up because I think when we talk about this genre and the things that we don't like seeing repeated, you know, we've joked that like every Souls-like has bonfires and fog walls. It's not to disparage those games, but it's to express frustration at like, well, what are the defining characteristics of a Souls-like, and maybe what should be those characteristics. It's not just having the blah sound and a foggy wall before a boss. And of course, whenever, and this is not a new thought, but like whenever there's a new genre, it begins with kind of blatant mimicry and then becomes a different thing.
Yeah.
So I think maybe we'll find like a clean answer to your question after we've talked through. I've listed here, it was actually in response to a conversation we had about Lies of P, which is a great game and a game you really liked, but a game that I found maybe was on the fence of being derivative. After I expressed that, you know, a lot of people politely like bounced back to that idea, or retorted like, well, it is a really great example of the Souls-like, and it's doing all these things really uniquely. And it inspired me to put a list together of games that are Souls-likes that I would say are, like, in my opinion, pushing the genre further and broadening the definition of what a Souls-like is.
Yeah, I think actually a good place to start, even before we get into that list, is what FromSoft has done themselves, right? Like FromSoft went and made Demon's Souls, Dark Souls 2, and then started to deviate. Before they even got to Dark Souls 3, they were like, hey, check this out. It's called Bloodborne. It's like, what if Dark Souls, but Lovecraftian and with really like rapid fire, horrifyingly fast combat that rewards aggression instead of, you know, the sword and board hiding behind your shield, slowly, you know, maneuvering behind a boss so you can hit them from behind. And then you get a game like Sekiro that's like, okay, what if a Souls-like, but with a real, like, in your, I mean, as in your face as FromSoft gets, I guess, but like in your face, like narrative kind of PlayStation Studios third person action adventure idea and framework with the Souls combat without the ability to change weapons, you know, like locking into one specific thing. And then of course you get the exact opposite of that with Elden Ring. It even seems like FromSoft is asking this question internally over and over again and saying like, how can we push ourselves? How can we push this genre that we've kind of invented further and further and further by showing other developers all of the different ways that, like, it's almost just flexing over and over again, but it's just like, let's just show all of the different ways that we can iterate on our own formula. Whereas you do get some games, you know, Lies of P, again, like you said, it's a game that I enjoy, but it is a game that is very much following the model and the framework of Bloodborne for a long time until it starts to kind of unveil that it is doing something different and interesting and unique. But here's FromSoft being like, oh, no, this is an open world game. And also it still works with this combat.
Yeah, they've continued to evolve, but also there's no question it's a FromSoft game when you're playing.
Yeah, exactly.
You know? Even something like Armored Core, which is like about as, in their recent library, as different as it gets, still has some Souls-like energy to it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm gonna start here. I think a fitting place to start would be Nioh 2, because I think the first Nioh came out at a time where I think Souls-likes were really becoming a genre. Like other games were trying to tackle the same heights of FromSoft, and Nioh, the first one, was the first time I saw critics and you know, people I follow online being like, this might be the one to rival FromSoft. This might be like the non-FromSoft Souls-like that is as successful.
Yeah.
And I still haven't played the first one, despite my great introduction there. But I had played a lot of Nioh 2. And Nioh 2 is just like, in many ways, it has the qualities that we make fun of. Like, there are some things that it's pulling from Souls that I don't think it needs to. But I do think, like, the things about it that work for me, one, the weapon variety is huge. And there are so many skills to learn in each weapon, which range from, like, tonfas to giant Grim Reaper scythes. And the more you use a weapon, the better you get at it. And it really leans into, it's developed by Team Ninja, it leans into the fighting game DNA that's in a lot of their games. And it makes Nioh, like, distinctly more gamey than a lot of the FromSoft stuff. Like, I think there is like a feeling in a lot of FromSoft games that you are walking through a living myth, which is partially why the lore of those games is almost equally popular to the games themselves.
Right.
But Nioh is like, it feels like, and I mean this as a compliment, it feels like the PS2 rental, like, junk food version of FromSoft, but just like really leaning all in on the mechanics, leaning all in on enemies exploding into power-ups, and just having kind of an absurd variety of combat options. I think that's a really cool approach to take at FromSoft's formula, where it's like, we're not even going to try to have the same, like, narrative importance. We're going to lean into what we're really good at with, like, battle mechanics and fighting games, and kind of make a entry within this genre that is focused on those things.
Yeah, totally. I think the Nioh games are fascinating. And what was the one that they just came out with recently? Rise of the Ronin?
Yeah,
that is like
similar.
Going after a similar idea, but is like even more narratively focused. It seems like Team Ninja like really has kind of their eye on the ball in terms of trying to expand it out in a way that works for them specifically. And I think that's the thing that really sets the successful ones apart, is like, a lot of these developers are coming at it from the perspective of like, what are we really good at and what can we blend with this genre? Because as soon as you take another genre and smash it into Souls-like, usually you're going to get something at least interesting. I think like the one for me that stands out that I just have to shout out is Remnant. I think Remnant is like such a fascinating, weird thing where this team decided on at the very high level to say, hey, what if we made a Souls-like where you had guns instead of swords? And also made it multiplayer, and like that by itself I think sets itself apart. It does have bonfires, it does have fog walls, but even just by switching those two mechanics around, I think you suddenly have a completely different framework for your game design. And again, leaning into what makes this developer so interesting is, before they even got to Remnant, they had another game that was called Chronos. That was like this VR game that set up this whole world and universe that was like so strange about using these big crystals to teleport between different realities. And by imbuing Remnant with that, it created what for you and I was like one of the most refreshing, exhilarating, weird games we had ever played, because it feels like kind of like a B sci-fi movie version of FromSoft in a lot of ways, where you and I just like were playing online together and we kept, you know, putting our hands on this big crystal and not believing the place that we ended up in next. Like, not only was the game fun mechanically in terms of like you and I having this kind of FromSoft experience together, being able to like have each other's backs when playing online, But outside of that, when we like got into a new space, it was like, oh my God, this is like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings suddenly for some reason. And then the next thing is like a far future Mad Max nightmare. It's incredible. Like it just continues to kind of blossom into this amazing tapestry that starts to, over time, really set itself apart and becomes Remnant more so than it is Dark Souls. And you get that even more so in Remnant 2 as they start to bring in even more aspects from like Diablo's whole like loot and shoot kind of idea, or Destiny's loot and shoot idea. It has kind of turned into what I consider to be Remnant more than it is the Souls-like with guns as it was in the first game.
Absolutely. Yeah, I just can't get over the like Shakespeare quotes when you die in the game over screen in that game.
So good.
So good. Remnant's great. Another one here is Unsighted, which might be a bit of a stretch to call Souls-like, but I think it counts. I mean, it's definitely a hybrid of a lot of things. There's like Metroidvania elements. There's like just like twin stick arcadey energy going on. And there is definitely FromSoft influence when it comes to what it means to die and sort of the stories happening with the NPCs around you. And not to spoil too much of the game, but Unsighted is about this community of androids that need a certain substance to stay sane, basically. You need to find this item to like keep these characters in control of their own minds, otherwise they become unsighted. And kind of like Majora's Mask, there's an in-game clock where like as you play the game and as you try to achieve the goals you have, certain characters may become unsighted in the background. And it leads to a lot of heartbreaking choices where like you kind of have to choose whether or not you invest in yourself or in others. And if you're investing in others, you can't save everybody. And I find that something that I really love about FromSoft's work are those little stories that play out through the course of the game that are almost always tragic.
Right. Do you tell the people in Bloodborne about the church or not?
Yeah. Yeah. And like, if you invest in those stories, I mean, I think all the time about the character in Bloodborne, the first person you meet through the window.
Oh, yeah.
Who like basically just tells you where to go. And like in any other game, it would just be like, this person's coughing because they're sick and they tell you where to go. And that's just like a little bit of environmental storytelling and, you know, a little moment. But of course, in Bloodborne, if you like actually go back to him, there's a story that plays out and it ends with that window being broken and a werewolf just wandering the area. And you'll kill it instinctually because you've been killing werewolves for 40 hours at that point.
Right.
And if you take a second to see that, oh, that was that character who was the first living thing in this game to help me for no reason but to be nice.
Yeah.
It's really heartbreaking and really powerful, and it is an example of a story only a game can tell. And Unsighted, I think, is taking that little moment and kind of basing a game around it. And I think another cool thing about Unsighted is that it's explicitly queer, which is great to see in a game like this. I think, you know, we don't really see that representation in this genre or in games a lot. So I think that's important too. Really cool game. I would recommend checking out Unsighted if you haven't.
Yeah, it's really good. Here's a complete pivot from there, from indie to AAA. But I think this is one of those situations where you have a game that is taking the FromSoft formula and blending it with so much stuff that it's like so apparent on the surface what it is trying to do, and does manage to pull it off. And that would be the Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order and Jedi Survivor series. Those two games, I think honestly Survivor more so than Fallen Order in a lot of ways, but it really all started with Fallen Order having this idea of taking the like Uncharted aspect of the way you're telling a narrative story in the Star Wars universe in particular, blending that with kind of a Metroidvania in terms of the ways in which you use your new Force abilities and equipment and stuff to traverse that space, but having all of the combat be essentially based in Dark Souls, I think was like a really interesting mishmash that actually kind of became something that worked the more of that game you played, and it definitely works in Jedi Survivor in particular. But I think the thing that really stands out about Fallen Order to me in terms of like taking this genre and pushing it forward is they're really explicit about the moments in which the game does turn into Dark Souls. Like the game is mostly Uncharted for most of it, and like, yeah, any stormtrooper for the most part like can kick your ass and kill you, which I think is, you know, a little bit weird in terms of like the balance of the power fantasy of being a Jedi, et cetera, but it does make every fight feel a little bit tense. That having been said, though, there are discrete zones where when you wander into them, it'll be like, oh, here's a big ass boss. And you don't have to fight this boss, but if you do, you're going to get a bunch of like fun, weird little cosmetic upgrades. You might get, you know, some kind of skill point that you'll be able to throw into something. You'll be rewarded and compensated well for your like challenge to yourself to be able to pull that stuff off. That, alongside the addition of just like a pretty basic difficulty slider, I think does a lot actually in terms of proving out the pushback that you constantly hear about Dark Souls, that like these are games that don't need difficulty sliders. If you're not good at them, you just need to get better at them, et cetera, et cetera. I think Fallen Order and Survivor specifically like really stand in stark contrast to that, where they are both games that manage to be difficult, be challenging, incorporate that style of combat, while also allowing people who maybe don't feel the need to like prove their worth via a video game the capacity to just like either skip it or tone the difficulty down to like get the reward for themselves and still have a satisfying experience. And I think that's super important.
Yeah, I think those games succeed in approachability in a way that FromSoft has really not even tried to.
Yeah, you know, as much as you can praise everything that they've managed to accomplish over the years, like that is really one of the main things that FromSoft has not budged on at all, and it's like kind of a bummer. You know, it's like the thing that you could really like knock them down for, I think, at the end of the day.
That's a fitting transition to this next game I have here, which is Tunic. Tunic is a game that, like all these games, is borrowing a lot from FromSoft, but it does allow you to turn the difficulty down, and I don't think it suffers as an experience because of that at all. That being said, though, I do think that the combat here is almost kind of unnecessary to the experience of Tunic. It's ironically a case of a Souls-like where I don't think they needed to mirror the combat to still be taking inspiration from Souls-like successfully, or from FromSoft successfully. Because what makes Tunic so wonderful is like there's that moment that everyone points to in the first Dark Souls where you go down that elevator and you all of a sudden are in the starting area of the game again. And you realize you've kind of untied this giant knot. And you've learned more about how this world connects, and it feels like this like thought out space that has a history and it has like a reason to connect in certain ways. And like learning more about that and untying the place and learning how to navigate it feels almost as cathartic as beating the bosses do. And Tunic is really a game that is built around that feeling of uncovering the world map, where it's a game that is all about discovery. It's a game that's constantly making you sit there in disbelief at like, oh my God, this was in the game the whole time and I never knew.
Yeah.
The game has a language that, you know, a fictional language that you can't decipher right away. So everything is kind of taught to the player just through intuition and through experience. And I think that alone, I think what I'm realizing as we go through these games is that like it doesn't have to be bosses and combat to make it a Souls-like. I think the way that this map is designed and that feeling of discovery is as important and as crucial to the identity of FromSoft's games as the combat is.
Yeah.
You know, and I think what makes these games successful is the fact that they're all taking a piece of it and maybe focusing more on one aspect of FromSoft's library and not just trying to do the whole experience in their own way.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have one more here, and it's Hollow Knight, and I don't need to tell you anything about this game. If you were on YouTube watching a video about video games, I think you already know why it's here. But I do think if I had to just choose really quickly, like what is the thing about Hollow Knight that makes it work and that makes it, for many people, the gold standard of like how and why Souls-like as a genre should exist outside of FromSoft's library, is that I think it is the closest a game has come to just hitting all the beats of a FromSoft journey, having the environmental storytelling, the NPCs with little stories, the really great combat with bosses, that sense of exploration and discovery. All of that's there, but it's in a world that is so unique and it's such a different design. I think this game is really the importance of design and art style, because I think in some ways it is exactly what I said for these games to not be, to try to be the overall experience, but just with a slightly different approach. But because the whole identity of the game and the visuals of the game are so separate, and the fact that it's 2D as well.
I was about to say, I think mechanically, it taking that aspect that you were just describing about Dark Souls and saying like that's just a Metroidvania, so why don't we just make the game a Metroidvania, is like one of the more brilliant aspects of Hollow Knight that they totally nail.
And Hollow Knight, I think, has become a game that there are even Hollow Knight likes at this point. You know, it has almost transcended like the good Souls likes. It's become its own thing.
I think you're totally right. That's a really interesting point, because there are definitely games, I think like Salt and Sanctuary is one that I could point at, that is another game that is trying to be a 2D Souls-like in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But there are games that are very explicitly, clearly Hollow Knight likes, even more so than they are 2D Souls-likes. And that's a fascinating development. As somebody who loves Hollow Knight, it's like one of my favorite games of all time, I've played through it many times. I am feeling at the same way you feel about Lies of P. I kind of feel about the Hollow Knight likes at the moment, where I'm like, I don't know if I'm ready to really dip into these yet. I think I need, if that's going to be a genre, I need it to mature a little bit more before I can dive in. Because right now I'm just like, why don't I just go play Hollow Knight all the way through again?
And full circle, I look forward to our eventual video about the best Hollow Knight likes and explore. But I think really, I mean,
Silk Song is going to be the best Hollow Knight like. Hopefully.
You know what? That's the perfect note to end on.
Yeah, thank you so much for watching, everybody. Remember to leave a comment if you have a Souls-like that you really like that we didn't bring up here. One that I wrote down that we didn't bring up is God of War 2018, which I think there's an argument to be made about that.
That's fair. Yeah, my other one here is Hyper Light Drifter, which was kind of similar reasons as Tunic and Unsighted. You know, just the environmental storytelling and all that.
If you got one that you think really stands out and has kind of pushed the genre forward, definitely let us know in the comments. But for now, thanks so much for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.